So, all right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? And people will probably trickle in as we go along here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Again, if you have any questions today, please use the chat function. If you're watching on Facebook, please use the comment function, and I'll be monitoring all that, and we'll bring that into our presentation today. So with me is Mr. Dale Davis and Salar Naimi. Nani, sorry. If you guys want to come off mute and kind of introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead, Salar. You go first.
Okay, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Salar Naimi, and I'm the Vice President of Business Development with Turning Point Energy. We're a clean tech development company focused on community and utility scale solar across the U.S. For reference, in the community solar sector, we've been very active, in particular on the East Coast, both on the policy as well as the development front. We've worked in Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maine, and Rhode Island markets, to name a few. The second hat I also wear is that I'm also on the board of the Coalition for Community Solar Access, also known as CCSA. CCSA is the National Trade Association for Community Solar. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Dale?
Thanks, Salar. Yeah, I'm Dale Davis from CMI Solar Electric. I also am president of the Delaware Solar Energy Coalition and represent the coalition on the Renewable Energy Task Force. Have spent almost 2 decades in solar in the region. We've done a number of different size systems, all the way up to some very large stuff that would be community solar scale stuff if it actually was community solar. But have not operated community solar subscriber programs. So Salar is definitely the contact expert on that side of the world. We're mostly construction and operations and maintenance on our side.
Thank you so much for both of you for being here. It turns out we lucked out on doing these events virtually today of all days with the snowiness going on outside. And we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of the interaction between community solar and residential solar, which is why we have 2 esteemed panelists today for our live stream. I know normally everybody's used to us doing 1. So why don't we dive right in? How much solar, and Dale, maybe you know this, how much solar is currently on the ground here in Delaware?
Yeah, so directly in Delaware, we have about 134 megawatts currently installed, 132, excuse me, currently installed in Delaware. There's also another 654 megawatts that's registered to be able to be used for RPS compliance that is actually installed in other states. So that gives us a total potential compliance number of 786 megawatts.
Yeah, what Dale's talking about there, just for a little bit of background for everybody, the RPS compliance works by Delmarva purchasing these credits that these solar arrays produce as part of their ongoing operations. And Delaware is one of the few states that has an open border policy. So projects that are built in other states can sell those credits to Delmarva here in Delaware. And so that's one of the many conversations that we're having around renewable energy right now, is if that's the right thing for Delaware to be doing. So maybe we'll have Dale back and we'll take a deep dive into that another day. So what's been kind of the average annual increase per year that we've seen in the past, Dale?
Yeah, so stuff being built in Delaware is running about 15 megawatts a year.
So, and that's kind of each year has been pretty consistent?
Yeah, there's been some variance. I mean, we've had a high of 15, a low of 10. So it's been relatively steady. It's really, a lot of it's been based on the available market for the SRECs.
So given that we're somewhere between 10 and 50 roughly a year. Solar, what has been the case in other states when community solar starts coming online? Is that number kind of grow significantly, or kind of still trickles in about the same pace, or what have you seen elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think a lot of that is, the biggest barrier to entry for community solar is really enabling policy that allows community solar projects to exist. So I think where we have seen there be a huge uptick, it really depends on what the policy allows. For example, policies allowing for a limited amount of megawatts, like we've seen in a state. In some states where, for example, Rhode Island only did a 30 megawatt pilot program initially, well, there's going to be a limit to how many megawatts you can get out of it. In other states where there hasn't been a limit and the policy enabling mechanism allowed for a robust program, I mean, we've seen numbers increase drastically. So it's really a function of, what policymakers decide ultimately to include in the legislation that can help with those, meet those RTS goals.
So what are some of the current limitations we have on community solar here in Delaware? I mean, there's not really there's no subscriber-based community solar here, really. So what are some of the limitations that we have stopping that, considering we've kind of had code, language in the code for community solar for some time? So what's the restrictions?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think, so the good news is that I think Delaware is a step ahead of most states without community solar, and that, as you mentioned, there is a statute. In that statute, in Delaware specifically, it's not known as community solar, but community-owned generating facility. Now, while this program has been around for some time, it has resulted in really no projects being built under the structure. And I think the reasons for that are really driven by, it's two primary reasons for that. Number one, the full economic participation in a community solar facility has been limited to customers that are located on the same distribution feeder as the facility. And so to kind of taking a step back, a community solar facility, let's say it can be sited on a rooftop or a ground mounted facility, and then that'll interconnect into the distribution system. So the smaller power lines to the site. And then typically, so what the law and what the statute essentially allows for is that if you're on the same distribution feeder as where the project is sited, you can get the full economic benefit. Well, the challenge is distribution feeders sometimes are miles and miles long. Sometimes they're shorter. They go in all sorts of different directions. They don't necessarily go up and down the street. And the only entities that actually have access to that information are the utilities due to security concerns. And so it's virtually impossible to try to predict, without doing some serious legwork, if you're trying to get community solar subscribers, where folks are going to be located such that they're both located on the same feeder. The second issue that has been really the barrier to any projects being developed is that the requirement that all the customers must be enrolled initially prior to the community solar project even being formed. And so I think to explain why that isn't how things are in practice, I think I could just give you guys a quick rundown of how solar projects in general are actually developed. And specifically, we're talking, calling, let's just say, a project of an average of a 2 megawatt for, 2 to 5 megawatts, let's just say, for scale purposes. So the entire development process, from initially identifying a site suitable for solar to taking it to finish, that process can take about anywhere from 18 to 36 months. The developer would need to go get site control, complete site surveys, environmental studies at the site, receive its discretionary and construction permits, go through a full interconnection process with the utility, and secure financing. So there's a lot of different steps that essentially take place for a project to go from to actually being feasible. And there's inherently a lot of risk in this process, so it's very common for projects to drop out in the various stages. It's only then, once that project is near de-risked and close to being fully developed, then customers are traditionally engaged about signing up for a project. And so, to kind of just put it plainly, it'd be very difficult, and under the current statute, it'd be very difficult to try to go sign up a bunch of customers for a project when a project is really at such an early hypothetical stage. So if I had to pinpoint the two, biggest reasons, those would be the two that I would point out.
Right. And
hey, Salar,
go ahead, Dale.
Yeah, this is Dale Salar. Just a question. I know, in other states, we've been able to build much larger than 2 megawatt systems. And I know that there's been some concern that the 2 megawatt size cap currently on community solar may make them less economically attractive to get developed and installed. Do you have a theory on that?
Yeah, so I think, just like anything else, there's, scale certainly helps. I think one of the biggest things we've seen is that when you get to about a 5 megawatt size, one of the biggest things we see that kill projects all the time are interconnection costs. So, as I mentioned, we will do an interconnection study as we're developing a project, which basically will let us know what the capacity is on the line, if we need any upgrades in order to interconnect. And so we find that a lot of projects drop out during that interconnection process. CCSA in particular recommends, you want 5 megawatts, kind of the sweet spot, if you will, for you to get enough scale, not be too large, but get enough scale such that you can start absorbing some of those heftier interconnection costs.
And so that's great to know kind of the process kind of behind the scenes on how community solar is created and the steps that it has to go through. But a lot of the questions that we get are more on the practical kind of user end side of things. So with these subscription projects, I know with residential solar, right? And Dale, you can correct me if I'm wrong. If you're buying the project outright, like if you're the owner of the project, then you have to pay those upfront costs that kind of get offset over time with tax credits and that sort of thing. If you're doing a power purchase agreement, Dale, I know you've talked about that in the past with us, that you can kind of take care of some of the costs with that. But with this subscription process in community solar, is there upfront costs? Is there kind of immediate cost savings? How does that work on that end?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think traditionally there have been two different ways that you can sign up for a community solar project. So I think it really depends on, and really the two different ways are really just two different methods of financing the project. As you mentioned, there's a more traditional ownership model that someone would essentially try to own a community solar facility. And the payback period on something like that would really depend on the financing mechanism. I'll suggest in the community solar space that is not very common, the ownership model, for all the reasons I just mentioned. There's a lot of things that need to be coordinated on the development side in order to get a project off the ground. The more common way that we see in all the markets that we operate in is more the subscription model, as you alluded to. Which under that scenario, the customer, from the customer's perspective, they basically just sign up for the community solar project. They get a subscription. They right off the bat, they don't have to typically there's no money down or anything like that. And then they save money right off the gate, right off the bat. They'll receive a credit, and they'll typically get anywhere from a 10 to 15% discount on the value of that credit is what they actually pay. So, really, they're very flexible contracts. Traditionally, very little to no termination if a customer decides that they move, or for whatever reason they can't keep up with the subscription. So we really, as an industry, done a good job of kind of simplifying it for the customer and just allowing them to participate and immediately start seeing savings day one.
So has that kind of been the experience in the states around us that have community solar? I know Maryland and New Jersey, I think, are starting to get underway with their projects. How about like Virginia? Is there any projects like in Pennsylvania that are kind of similar to this? So basically, like somebody asked the question like regionally, what's the community solar experience been?
Sure. It's a good question. So what I would suggest is that probably the furthest along, there's a lot of states that have either introduced legislation or passed legislation. I think Maryland is probably the furthest ahead in terms of having enabling legislation and projects in the ground. And all the projects that have been completed in Maryland have been kind of more under that subscription model, if you will. There are other states in the region. Pennsylvania has some legislation pending, not passed yet. Virginia just passed legislation. So I would say, those two markets are earlier stages, Virginia being a little bit further ahead. And then New Jersey is another market that more recently passed legislation. They're in the implementation process. They're actually starting to get some of the first projects off the ground now in Jersey. So lots of states, a lot of the states all around, and to my knowledge, all the projects that are being developed and implemented in those states are under this traditional subscription model.
So, but there's other states that have been doing community solar for quite some time. I know Minnesota is kind of the example everybody goes to because they have the largest market. So in the states that have been doing this, Minnesota, New York, Massachusetts, I think Connecticut has a good program as well. Have they been finding mostly subscription based as well?
Yeah, great question. Yes, to my knowledge, all the community solar markets with robust programs are under the subscription model. There's a big reason for that is, aside from a lot of the development, some of the things that I mentioned, there's also the financing side. There's tax credits associated with these projects, so the ability for someone to fully, monetize that tax credit and be able to maximize that it's much simpler if it's done kind of at the under the subscription model. And so, but yeah, we've seen, in Minnesota, Massachusetts, New York, those are some of the more Colorado, those are some of the more robust community solar markets in the country, and those are all done under a subscription model as well.
Gotcha. So, excuse me. So, kicking it to both kind of you and Dale, what's the reception in the residential side of the solar industry with community solar? Is it kind of like a competition thing, or do a lot of the companies have kind of crossover? Dale, what's the kind of feeling with the solar industry here already on the ground in Delaware?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So I think there's two things you have to consider with community solar. I think the only issue the smaller installers, this residential small commercial installers have, is that community solar coming in at 5 megawatts a piece, if we're only currently able to absorb 10 to 15 megawatts into the market, what does that do with the market? That there's ways to fix that in the legislation. I think that gets taken care of. I think the important thing, I don't think community solar is in competition with other types of solar. It's really a different market and a different approach. If you look at community solar, it's very good for people who, for one reason or another, can't put solar on their properties, either on their roofs or other parts of their property. It's great for a portable community where you might not be living in your house or occupying that commercial building long enough to get your return on investment if you were to purchase your own solar array. So the ability to come in and out of a community solar system as you move, as your needs change, et cetera, that's very valuable. The other opportunity for community solar is in that financing piece, especially with the low and moderate income. If there's a way for the low and moderate income community to participate, see immediate savings, and not have to have the ability to finance or invest in systems directly, I think there's a lot of room for community solar. It could really revolutionize the amount of solar that we install in Delaware and have it be installed here rather than satisfying our demands from out of state.
Solar, has that kind of been the experience that you've seen in other states as well? It's been more of a kind of cooperative relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't tell you, both from the industry perspective, as well as even on the customer perspective, I think we see the two being very complementary. We don't see them in competition with one another. One of the other things I'll point out is that, CCSA actually recently conducted a study with other industry groups. And what the study ultimately found was that in general, scaling distributed resources by about 250 gigawatts by 2050, we can actually lower the overall cost of the grid by $473 billion. And at the same time, meet aggressive climate goals. So I think the reality is, from both a cost perspective as well as a climate change perspective, we really need both. And I think in our experience, we've seen a lot of synergies between both the residential installer community as well as the community solar industry.
Great, wonderful. That's good news to hear. One of the things, we wanted to set out in the proposal that the Sierra Club has presented is that, when looking at carve outs and RPS requirements, making sure that it is kind of a cooperative model, that we're not, taking from one pot to fill the other pot. As you just said, we kind of need both to really meet the goals that we want to set to avoid the worst impacts of climate change here. So are there companies, both of you had mentioned low income communities and community solar. And so that's another question we've kind of gotten a lot of interest around, is how does it work for low income communities? I know I've seen, like in Colorado, the state actually did a pilot project that was specifically targeted for low income communities. And they were able to actually generate, I think they estimate around 50% savings on electric bills. So are there companies, my question right now is, are there companies that specifically work for creating projects for low income communities to help, finance those upfront costs to get the projects that are going to make the most sense for those particular individuals?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Yes, to answer your question, there are companies that, both companies as well as nonprofit entities that focus on the low-income sector. There are also a lot of companies that both do traditional community solar as well as community solar with low income. My company is one of those. We've done a number of community solar projects that are more traditional, and then we have another project we're developing in Maryland where 30% of the capacity is going to low and moderate income households. So I think at the end of the day, a big driving force in this and a trend we're starting to see are carve outs. The benefit of community solar is that because you're financing, you're kind of putting together a bunch of different customers, you're able to, if you have a carve out for a portion of that going to low income households, you're able to still get your project financed and still be able to reach that community. So I think a lot of that is policy driven, and we're definitely seeing a trend where you see more carve outs in policy that basically says, okay, you can do let's say a 5 megawatt project, but you got to commit that at least 15% of that at a minimum is going to go to low income communities. So we're definitely seeing a trend to that type of structure, and it's great. I think it's great for the industry because traditionally that's been a population that has been underserved, quite honestly. And so this is a means of being able to serve that community and do the right thing at the same time.
So I've gotten a few
And,
questions.
and
Go ahead, Dale.
yes, Solar touched on something that I think is important there in the community solar proposed legislation, and that is that there's a requirement to serve the low and moderate income community with these community solar systems. When we look at what happened in the leasing market residentially, which is another type of market where somebody else owns the system, but the customer gets immediate savings. Low and moderate income was locked out of that market primarily because they were looking for credit scores north of 700 to put those systems on people's houses, and it didn't work for a lot of folks. And so having a substantial carve out for that in community solar requirements will make sure that it happens.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the things we felt was really important. So we're going to get to kind of compare and contrast a little bit later on, the bill that was filed last year, which was SB 250 for those following along at home, and what what we've kind of worked on with our partners here and what we're proposing. But that was one of the changes, that before it was an extra credit sort of situation. If you reached 5% low and moderate income, which the definition was a little bit wonky as well in that, so it could have been an income that most people wouldn't consider low income, then you got extra credits if you got that 5% mark. And a lot of states, and Solar, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of states just have outright requirements, and they've been able to achieve, on these big projects, 15% inclusion. And so that's what we've aimed for here in this bill. I mean, has that been your experience, Solar, in other states, that they've been able to hit that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think key is that you have a carve out that is financeable, right? There's 15% is sort of a sweet spot that we have seen, that we've been able to successfully finance projects with. But yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think you want something that's that's reasonable, that a majority of developers can achieve, so that you have robust participation. But then I think it's also important to include that so that the onus is on the developers to make sure that they're reaching that community as well.
Yeah. So Dale talked a little bit about consumer protections, which is another thing. We had conversations around pretty early on that the Sierra Club was very adamant around having strong consumer protections. I know a lot of these issues came up very early in the community solar history, with some bad actors doing some shady deals, and that's certainly states have learned those lessons and built in those protections. So what are some of the kind of consumer protections that you've seen being developed in other states?
Yeah, so great question as well. Full of them today for sure. So I think at the end of the day, it's very state specific, right? And I think what's key is kind of a first step is that you get a group of various stakeholders together, the utility commission, utilities, the industry, and really kind of put the framework together for strong regulations that comply with existing federal and state consumer protection laws. I think that's kind of the first step, and what we've seen. The best way to do that is through kind of a working group process where everybody can you get a lot of folks from the local community that can provide some very state specific guidance, but then you also have folks from the solar industry that have maybe worked in other markets and can kind of lend some of the lessons learned from there. I think the other thing that kind of goes hand in hand with that, which is very common, is a standardized consumer disclosure form. And so what a standardized consumer disclosure form does is it outlines some of the major deal terms in a contract, so they are very specifically spelled out. So for example, those can include things such as the length of the contract. Is it a discount, or is it a fixed price for a billing credit, or is it a discount that just moves with the value of the bill of credit? There's termination clauses. So when you have standardized consumer disclosure forms, then if a customer is looking to sign up, let's say there's two different providers, they get two different contracts, but then on top of that, they'll get the standardized disclosure forms, which are approved by the regulator. And then they can very quickly just look at those consumer disclosure forms and be able to tell, okay, in my left hand, this is what this offer is. In my right hand, this is what the offer is. They can make those, those decisions. And then I think lastly, it's consumer education at the grassroots level. So a lot of what we're doing here today and talking about the issues and making sure that folks are educated about it. So I think that's kind of the last piece of it. But those are, I would say, the three big ones I would highlight to ensure that you're getting the consumer protections right.
Great. So I want to kick over a couple of the questions we've gotten off of Facebook and off of our chat function here. So Charlie brought up a question around power purchase agreements. So I wasn't entirely sure how to phrase this one, but essentially, can you split a project between, a power purchase agreement? Actually, you know what? I'm going to do this. Charlie, I know you're better at talking, speaking for yourself than I am. So I'm going to ask you to unmute so you can ask your question.
Sure. Thanks, Dustin. I was thinking that if a solar developer says, I've got some land here, I'm going to put up a bunch of solar panels, and maybe there are not enough people around who want to get involved in the community solar side of things. Maybe I could sell off half of the rest of the power from the other side of the solar farm through a PPA or power purchase agreement to the city of Lewis or the city of whoever. Maybe Lewis is not a good example, they're within Dimick. So to the city of Rehoboth Beach. Is that a possibility? I would think it might. It would give greater flexibility to a solar farm. Is that something we've seen? Is that doable?
Absolutely. Great question. And yes, I think oftentimes we talk about community solar in the context of residential subscribers, but in its true form, a lot of the markets get a nice mix, right? You'll get a lot of local businesses that may want to subscribe to a project. You also get a lot of residents. So you can certainly have a mix. And I think, you touched on the term PPA and just to clarify, so the subscription, we call it a subscription in the community solar world, but it's the functionality and the basics are very similar to a PPA. I think the only difference you might see and why it's more so called a subscription is that typically it's just a discount to the bill credit. So let's say the bill credit's worth, let's just say, for example, 10 cents. You get, you sign up for, you get a 10% discount, you're only paying 90% of that. If that bill credit fluctuates, what you're paying fluctuates, but you're always locked in at that 10% guaranteed savings. So, but what you described is very common. You see it all the time. Maybe there's a anchor tenant, quote unquote, right, where you have a company that has a lot of load, a farming operation. They might subscribe to, let's say, a big chunk of the power. Let's just say 50% of it, and then the balance of that is going directly to residents and low-income communities, et cetera. So, but yes, to answer your question, you see that all the time, and what we are contemplating here certainly, in terms of the legislation, certainly allows for that.
So I think our snowy day, and sorry to those who are on Facebook. Well, I guess you can't see me right now on Facebook. Our live feed on Facebook got interrupted, but we'll post the full video when we're all done here. But I think our snowy day got to one of our viewers here, and they asked, Dale, maybe you'll be able to answer this, what the impact is on snow in the winter months on solar power.
Well, certainly, solar is a variable resource. You're going to see less kilowatt hours made on a winter day than a summer day just because of day length. You'll see less when it's cloudy, and if your array is covered up with snow, you're going to see a whole lot less, if anything. But solar really looks at what we're producing over a period of time. We're not trying to be a nuclear power plant that's producing 24/7. Obviously, that's not going to be effective. So when you look at solar, it's pretty predictable using weather patterns, how much you're going to make a month, how much you're going to make a year. There'll be variability day to day, week to week, month to month, but it's relatively predictable within a few percent. And that's really what you look at. You don't look at, I need power at 2 o'clock in the morning and my solar's not on.
Great, thanks. So are there currently ways in Delaware to get solar to low-income communities, Dale? I know you had said that a lot of them are being either credited out or priced out. So are there other limitations and ways that people have found to work around that?
Yeah, so that's been the challenge, Dustin. Somebody has to fund those systems somewhere, somehow. So they either get funded by somebody who wishes to be philanthropic in the situation, or they get funded through grants or a government entity, or they get financier funded, and that's where you run into the credit worthiness problems. This is why we haven't seen a lot of it in Delaware. There's some other states where the utilities themselves have participated in funding some of those systems, some of the distributed solar on folks' homes. We've got a couple of small examples in Delaware where, like, the Wilmington Housing Authority has a system where they use their power to satisfy their bills, and that benefits the residents because they don't have individual electric meters. They work off the power provided by the WHA. So those kinds of systems work, but it's been a challenge, and I think in my mind, that's the brightest spot for community solar, is the ability to serve that community.
Muted myself there. So somebody else had a question about whether or not there are any prospective projects that are ready to crop up in Delaware. Solar, I don't know, maybe Dale, I don't know if either of you have heard if there's any companies or projects that are kind of ready and raring to go once we have the right bill in place, or?
So
that's a challenging question to discuss. There's certainly stuff on the books. There's projects that could be converted over their current situation. One of the challenges you have in Delaware is, right now we can do what's called net metering or aggregated net metering, community solar. The community doesn't work. So we've got some aggregated systems, which are where a single owner has multiple meters spread around the utilities territory, and they can install solar in one place and benefit their own meters. They just can't benefit anybody else's meter. Similar to community solar, except the communities themselves. There are some other projects that are direct to grid projects, meaning they just produce merchant power, feed it up to the utility grid, either at the utility level or at the transmission level. They receive a relatively low amount of money per kilowatt hour for those projects, and those are projects that have a potential maybe to get converted over to community solar relatively quickly once there's enabling legislation.
Salar, anything to add?
No, I think I think that, look, developers a lot of times there'll be some in the development community that might speculate, right? So to Dale's point, I think the point was spot on, which is there could be some projects that end up being converted, but I think most of the time you'll see a lot of development activity start to pick up if there's a path to enabling legislation. So to my knowledge, there's not much development activity, but if we can get some traction here, which is obviously the hope, I think that can change very quickly.
Yeah. So another question we've gotten a lot is, how does it work for communities that want to do community solar? And I'm going to spend a good amount of time kind of so we can compare and contrast here from what was proposed last year to what we're proposing this year for 2021. But before in the previous bill, the communities could kind of go through this authorizing process with their county or municipality. So outside of that, I mean, do communities in other states kind of contract with companies like Turning Point or Grid Alternative to create projects that kind of work for their needs? Is that kind of the avenue that communities have used in the past to kind of create their own projects?
Yeah, no, it is a great question. And I think, yes, to answer your question, in our experience, that has been the route where, for example, we have a customer, Cedar Ridge Community Church in Maryland. They wanted to host a community solar project, and they love the idea of targeting low-income communities, but they don't have the expertise, they don't have the access to capital to be able to do that. And so, we ended up partnering with them in an arrangement where we basically kind of took on all the development, all the financing, but they made their land available to host the project. So yes, to answer your question, a lot of what we see is kind of more under the traditional structure, the traditional community solar, I'll call it, but in partnership, where there'll be some sort of partnership between whoever a host may be who wants to host the community solar project and a developer that has the expertise to take that project from, the initial glimmer in an eye to commercial operation where it's providing some kilowatt hours to customers.
Great. So as I said, I want to give us a decent chunk of time here to kind of talk about, oh, we had a question come in. 1 second here. So we'll come back to that question. What are some of the differences between the legislation that was set up with the authorities process and kind of what we're talking about now? And kind of how does that resolve some of those issues that were in the previous code that you had talked about in the beginning of our live stream here today?
Sure. So I think the new legislation from this year, it still contemplates the other structure of forming community solar through the authority, but then also allows for kind of the more, what I'll call the third party structure, if you will. Some of the major things that this year's bill, to your point, is that we are targeting to fix the feeder issue that we discussed before. And as I just mentioned, the idea of doing the third party model. There is the addition of the low income carve out, which requires that every project needs to, at a minimum, provide at least 15% of its capacity to low income customers. There were some language added to the bill around the consumer protections that we touched on a little bit here today. That basically allows for a working group to be, or requires rather, a working group to be formed within a few months after passage to try to come up with consumer protections as well as the disclosure forms that we discussed. There was another concept is that the ownership of RECs, and when I say RECs, I mean renewable energy credits. So anytime a solar project generates electricity, it not only generates that electricity, those electrons, but then also there's renewable energy credits associated with it. So it's the renewable attribute of that power. And so the new legislation gives the ability for that to either go to the customers or go to the facility, which allows the facility to either to give it directly to the customer if they choose, or have the flexibility to monetize that on behalf of the customers. What we find is that a lot of times customers prefer to give up those RECs because they just don't want to deal with the hassle of trying to figure out what to do with it. They prefer to give it to the developer and take a higher level of savings in exchange. Those are some of the higher level things that I know that are in the new legislation as compared to the existing legislation. There's some more cleanup items, but those are the main points.
Yeah, I think one of the big changes, and this has came up a lot more in recent meetings with legislators, is how is our non-Delmarva utilities impacted by this? And so
that's a great point. Glad you brought it up. Yep, and I think that the new legislation essentially carves out some of the I'll call it investor-owned utilities. So basically it's a program for Delmarva, and doesn't require that any of the other cooperatives or municipal utilities participate.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction. It gives the DMEC and the Rural Electric Cooperative the ability to participate if they so choose to do so, but they are in no way required to do so.
and that has a lot to do, right, with the fact that you have to, the subscriptions and the project have to be in the same service territory, right? So you can't have a project in Delmarva and then sell subscriptions into a city represented by the Delaware Electric Municipal Energy Corporation or the Delaware Electric Co-op, right? You have to stay within the confines of where the project is, correct?
Right, and those other non-Delmarva utilities also get to maintain control of their supply and how it gets distributed.
Solar, you look like you were getting ready to say something. I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I think Dale hit the nail on the head. It's logistically, I mean, the only thing I would add is, logistically, it's all the successful programs we've seen in the country. If the project is located within a utility service area, the customers just need to be located there as well. So from a logistical perspective, it definitely makes the most sense.
So my understanding is the legislation that was written last year allowed these municipalities like say Newark, for example, which is in a DMEC, which is Delaware Municipal Energy Corporation, for those following along. It's a DMEC territory. So the past legislation, and we didn't change this, the city of Newark could themselves say, we want to do a community solar project, and then they pass an ordinance and they can work with a community to create a project. But in terms of what we're talking about here, the subscription service, it would not be able to be built in those territories, right? It's only to Delmarva, correct?
Correct. That's exactly right. Yep.
Wonderful.
Well, unless they so chose to do it that way. I mean, I don't think there's anything in the legislation that would prohibit Newark from deciding to build a community solar that they use a subscription service model with if they chose to do so.
Great. Thank you. Yes, great clarification. Right. So the city of Newark could have passed that ordinance and decide that they want to do community solar, and then yes, they can set up to do subscriptions out of that project. Point being that like Turning Point couldn't come into DMEC and create a project and then sell subscriptions, right? The city of Newark would have to initiate the process.
Yep, that's right.
Great. So how can we advocate for a strong community solar? And we're coming up on the end of our time, and I want to stick to time for everybody. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat now. But how can we, as individuals and advocates and organizations, like how can we help advocate for a strong community solar bill?
Okay, sorry, Dale, I wasn't sure if you were going to jump in there. So I think from my perspective, at the end of the day, it really comes down to the grassroots involvement and people in Delaware coming together and pushing their legislators to pass something, right? There's an old saying, I always love it. It's like the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? And so I think to the extent that you get out there, you talk about it, you educate folks on the concept, and really push your legislators to do it. I think at the end of the day, that's really what helps get legislation across the finish line. It's not companies like myself that get legislation passed. It's the grassroots, the folks, the boots on the ground that ultimately convince legislators to get these bills done. So to continue to do what you're doing, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, and Dustin, events like this that you've been so kind to put together, this is I think the third or fourth one. That outreach to education so that people really understand what's needed and why it's needed is so important. Energy is complex, and it's difficult to really get down into the weeds and understand all the nuances. But community solar is a little different than that. I think it's easy for people to see the need for community solar once it's presented to them and why it's important.
Yeah, I know we had another question that came up around why wouldn't a utility like Delmarva just create their own project, their own solar, and do community solar? So I don't know, Dale, you wanted to touch on that. I know there's the issue, right,
Sure.
is kind of vertical integration, so to speak.
Yeah, so specifically Delmarva is a deregulated utility, and to my knowledge has not the ability to own any generation. When deregulation occurred, they had to divest themselves of generation, and they are basically a wire company. I mean, they transport power from generation to end users, and that's their responsibility and their task. So at this point in time, there would probably have to be different legislation that would enable them to actually build and own these systems themselves. Now, the other utilities in Delaware aren't so restricted, and they've done a fair amount of that, not so much on a community basis, but DEC and DMEC, a number of the DMEC cities have installed their own municipal owned or controlled system for producing power and feeding them to their customers.
Great. So I just want to kind of wrap this up and just say that, with this bill, we're hoping to really create economic opportunity in Delaware. I mean, solar represents about 500 jobs currently in Delaware. And you look around the country that has, states with community solar, and it's far surpassing the number of people employed in those states, because community solar projects have to be created in the state that they are selling subscriptions. So if you had a Delaware community solar program, all of the jobs for those projects have to be in the state. The project has to be created in the state. So we're not only getting an environmental benefit, we're not only helping reduce our reliance on the fossil fuel energy from out of state, but we're also creating economic opportunity in the state of Delaware. And that's one of the big things that we want to really talk more about as we move forward on these projects. The other thing I want to mention is that we are completely still respecting the vision that Senator McDowell had last year. The big difference between the two avenues of community solar that we're talking about here is that the McDowell version with the authority process was really set up for people that have no access to capital or expertise on community solar. Now, we've heard, as Solar said, other states, you just contract with companies that do community solar to do that, and they create a project that works for you. But Senator McDowell had the vision of these projects being 100% owned by the community, and thereby the RECs and other credits that come along with that to go into the community. Nothing in the bill that we proposed is changing anything that Senator McDowell. That is still like 100% viable avenue for community solar. If anybody's determined enough to work with their county or municipality to create an authority and go through all the processes that Solar had mentioned, they're still 100% free to do so. But as he said, 95% of the cases, if not more, people just want to save on their energy bills, and the subscription model will save you, 10 or more % of your electric costs on your energy bills. And that's the bottom line. That's what most people want. They don't want to deal with RECs. They don't want to deal with auctions. They don't want to deal with land acquisition. They just want lower energy bills, and they want to help save the planet. And so that's why it's so important. I think we give Delawareans the opportunity for both avenues of community solar. And we would be one of the first states to do that 2-avenue approach, We're learning the lessons from other states. We're doing what has worked well, very well, in a number of other states, but we're still respecting that vision that Senator McDowell had for the future. I think it's really important that we say that a number of times. And so I wanted to reiterate that again as we come to a close here. And I want to just give Dale and Salar, if you have any kind of parting words before we close out.
Yeah, sure, Dustin. I'd like to, hitch on to a little bit about what you said about Senator McDowell's vision. That model of a community-owned community solar system is no doubt the way that individual community members will have the highest level of savings. There's investment involved. There's a longer wait involved. There might not be an immediate savings depending on how things are financed, but over the long haul, the owner of the system, makes a lot of money on the system. And if that's a third party, there's a reason why they do that. And if the Senator McDowell model of these community formed authorities can be put into place and made effective, it's going to be very valuable when you look at the groups that could be created. They might not all be 5 megawatt arrays trying to sell to everybody in the state, but they could be churches and fire companies and those kinds of situations where they've got a little bit of land or a little bit of roof and could put it to good effect. And I think it's a very valuable model that I'm excited to be able to work on that.
Salar?
Yeah, and I completely agree. I mean, at the end of the day, having more options to create community solar projects is better than having less. And so I completely, echo everything Dale just mentioned. And then, in terms of parting words, really appreciate everybody's time and allowing me to speak here today. I'd like to be a resource if anybody has any questions or would like any follow-up discussion. I'm happy to do that. My email address, Dustin, you guys can ping Dustin. He can pass it along to me. And yeah, really hopeful that we can get something done. I think getting consumers electricity savings is ever so important, especially here as we're in this COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you very much. Appreciate everybody's time, and looking forward to trying to get something passed next year.
Great. Well, thank you all for tuning in. I know this was one of our longer live streams, but really important topic. So I really appreciate you sticking around and tuning in. And thank you to all the legislators that jumped on. I know we had Senator Spiros, Senator Sokola, Representative Ozienski was on. And I know I'm probably missing some as well. I know we had Drew Slater from the Public Advocate was here. We had Pam Knotts was here from the Public Service Commission. I really appreciate that, and Tom Noyes from DENREC. I really appreciate that some of our officials that are working for us here are tuning in and becoming more and more educated on community solar and renewable energy in general, and how we can keep moving forward and keep doing better. So I just really, really appreciate everybody and taking the time on this kind of snowy day. So thanks so much. And thanks to our presenters here. Thank you to Dale and Salar. Really appreciate all the work that you guys have been doing with the RPS Coalition. We have a lot of great organizations, and you guys have been putting in a lot of work. And I know we got some other people from the RPS Coalition on too. So thank you very much as well. You guys have a good one.
All right, Dustin, thank you for running this.
My pleasure.